Thank you, John, very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very eager to hear all of the good words that are going to be spoken this evening on this topic and the global influence and philanthropy. And I just wanted to just a very brief moment of the fact that lest you think that philanthropy is for the community foundation is just local. There's been a great emphasis in the past few years with helping to spread the word of what we call community philanthropy throughout the world. The Council of Michigan Foundations has been very actively involved with this, and you'll hear tonight definitely how a large foundation like the Kellogg Foundation has been actively involved in this area. The Community Foundation here, we have participated in a program where I was a fellow in a transatlantic community foundation exchange back in the year 2000. And I was informed 6 weeks prior to being gone for a month that the place I was going to be sent to was northern Italy. It was a tough assignment. So we have certainly had our influence in a global fashion as well. And not too shabby of a place as northern Italy, and I came back about 25 pounds heavier. Testimony of the fact that I wasn't just lecturing, I was also eating a lot of risotto. So certainly a great deal of excitement around the world and the whole issue of philanthropy. I am going to introduce to you a woman who has probably is the greatest influence in the area of philanthropy. And her name is Dorothy Johnson, Dottie Johnson. Dottie was one of the founders and the originating president of the Council of Michigan Foundations, which is the premier regional association of grant makers in this country. Dottie, however, I want you to know, if this is not in the program, was recently honored nationally. And she has been honored nationally quite a bit, but this was an award that I think, Dottie, probably means a great deal to you. And it was a Citizen Service Award given by the Voices for National Service, and just happened recently, and we're also proud of her work and hope that it's continued to be recognized. So with no further ado, I introduce you to Dottie Johnson.
Thank you, Diana. It's such a pleasure to be here. And for those of you who don't know it, but I suspect many of you do, Diana is not only a national but an international leader with community foundations. And not only that, she is chair of the board of the Council of Michigan Foundations. So my hat's off to you, friend. Tonight, you will hear about philanthropy. Does it have the power to make a global difference? I'm sure you have your own answer, and we'll look forward to hearing from you as the program evolves. You're used to the format. We will have a keynote. We have 2 responders, and then it's your turn with question and answers. In terms of introductions, I will say that these 3 individuals, our keynoter and the 2 responders, have one thing in common. And that is that they walk the talk. You can read their backgrounds in the program, but I'd like to tell you just a little bit about them that I've learned knowing them, some for a few months and some for many years. Joel is a professor. He's an author. He's a grant maker. He was a nonprofit leader, and he is a volunteer par excellence. Now, I'm not going to tell you about what a humorist he is, and et cetera, et cetera. You'll find that out. Ramya Ramanoff is from India, Chennai specifically, where she has been a social activist, a nonprofit leader, and we're so pleased she's at Grand Valley. She's a professor and a researcher, and I've learned tonight she's a good cook and a dancer. Now, Jim McHale, I have known for more than 15 years. And to see him is to love him. But I have watched Jim in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, starting youth councils, to meeting with governors in literally Mississippi, Montana, and Michigan, and many other places, I've seen him meeting with parents and families in remote villages of Mozambique or in the high Andes, to meeting the presidents of Chile and the Dominican Republic, to the King of Swaziland, and something that was most meaningful to Jim and to myself when we met twice with President Nelson Mandela. He is very comfortable in any of those settings. So, Jim, does philanthropy have the power to make a global difference?
Well, and after that introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. First, it really is an honor to be here. And it's really an honor, if I may express my appreciation to Diana Seeger for the Grand Rapids Community Foundation to be the sponsor of this event. Let me echo what Dottie says. Grand Rapids is truly, truly fortunate to have someone of Diana's reputation and stature running this community foundation. So, Diana, thank you for being a part of this. You may see in my bio that I'm a graduate of Aquinas College. Received my master's here in 1998, and so I owe a great debt to Aquinas College, not to mention probably a few still unpaid parking tickets. But I think the leadership at Aquinas may have expected me to use my newfound knowledge in the marketplace on behalf of some highly competitive corporation, but instead I guess I chickened out. I took a job with the Kellogg Foundation, an organization whose basic purpose it is to give away most of its profits each year. That's not exactly a stellar business model for someone who's trying to build a financial empire, I understand. But as it turns out, earning money and giving money away has more in common than I ever thought. In recent years, the business of giving, which we call philanthropy, has become much more businesslike. Meanwhile, business has become a lot more philanthropic as well as socially conscious. And many foreign governments, which used to clamor for foreign aid, say what they really want from other governments and foundations is not just aid, but investments and access to business markets. And then, as if to confound all the grumpy economists, remind us that Michigan is in a one-state recession, we have this piece of good news. Grand Rapids, Muskegon, and Holland, this area ranks second in the nation in terms of charitable giving. That's right. Your community gives an average of 10% of your discretionary income to charitable and religious causes. So if you're not already confused by these conflicting signals, then you're already not paying attention. So before I complicate matters further, let me return to the basics. Namely, does philanthropy have the power to make a global difference? And to that, I'll respond with an equivocal two-word answer. Yes, but. First, the yes part, which is quite easy. There is no doubt that philanthropy can be a major positive force in world affairs. It already is, and it already has been. From the polio vaccine to combating world hunger, breakthroughs funded by philanthropy saved tens of millions of lives in the 20th century. And even on a personal level, in quiet ways that most people know little about, philanthropy is having an enormous global impact. There's some fascinating news to share here, but I'll save that for the end. As for the second part of the yes but answer, here's what I see as the caveat. Yes, philanthropy can be an immensely important force for the global change in the 21st century at home and abroad. But to do that, it will have to be smarter, more flexible, and more cooperative, and not the least of all, more humble. These virtues are crucial because philanthropy is more public and prominent than ever. Remember in 2006 when Warren Buffett donated $31 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? That one event may have received more coverage than any story about philanthropy in world history. So in the public's estimation, philanthropy has finally become interesting. The new generation of donors, Oprah, Warren Buffett, Bono, and Lance Armstrong, make philanthropy seem hip, fun, and some might even say sexy. And these weren't necessarily words that were used to describe old school philanthropists like Henry Ford or W.K. Kellogg or Andrew Carnegie. They were serious, stalwart men who probably requested extra starch in their shirts. But of course, along with increased publicity has come more scrutiny from politicians and the news media. The foundation world is no longer a quiet little enclave where everyone trusts the inherent goodness of our intentions. As nonprofits, We have to demonstrate our value to society through responsible grant making and financial accountability. Yet for philanthropy to stay vital and relevant, there's no question that this influx of new people, money, and ideas is absolutely essential. That said, to make the most of these new opportunities on a global scale, I think it's crucial that philanthropy strike a balance in 4 key areas. First, we need to balance short-term passion with long-term perseverance. As a nation, it's the short-term direct aid stuff that Americans are best at and most familiar with. We've always been a can-do people, or to use a current example, we are a move that bus kind of people. That phrase, as most of you know, comes from the hit TV show Extreme Makeover, Home Edition. Many of you are familiar with that, I assume, right? Well, my wife just loves that show. And as an attentive male, it's really given me insight into what I think is the ultimate aphrodisiac for American women. I'm really convinced that it's not about money, looks, or fame. No, what my wife likes about Ty Pennington is that he can actually start and finish a home improvement project. This means that all tiles are laid, the baseboards are down, the drywall's all painted, and miraculously, within 60 minutes. Compare this with a guy like me who prefers to complete house projects in a very fluid 3 to 5 year time period. But beyond that, what Extreme Makeover does best is offer a brand new start for a family who desperately deserves it. And at the end, as the neighbors yell, "Move that bus," and a beautifully built home appears, we're right there with them. Even through the TV screen, we share the powerful endorphin rush that being generous provides. Again, Americans are great at short-term philanthropy, and we can be proud of that. Look what happened after the Asian tsunami or Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. We sent materials, mountains of materials, donated hundreds of millions of dollars, contributed our blood, sweat, and tears to rebuild houses and care for the sick and the needy. In a world full of natural and man-made disasters, there will always be a need for this type of giving. Yet to promote lasting change, we must balance short-term need with long-term commitment. Stubborn problems like poverty, disease, social injustice require steady, ongoing solutions, even if the odds of immediate success seem impossible. A case in point is the Kellogg Foundation's work in South Africa during the mid-1980s. At the time, South Africa's apartheid government was perhaps the most racist in modern history. So to punish South Africa, there were calls for corporations and foundations to suspend operations and withdraw all of their investments from the country. We didn't do that. Instead, the Kellogg Foundation began to quietly fund scholarships for black South Africans in fields such as education, business, law, and engineering. Back then, South Africa's all-white colleges and universities were far superior to the grossly underfunded all-black schools. However, we convinced several white schools to admit some of their first black students, a major concession at that time. We knew, of course, that black students would still face intense discrimination in the job market after graduation. Under apartheid, black graduates usually worked as social workers or underpaid teachers in rundown schools that were lucky to have a few broken desks and a little shelf of raggedy textbooks. Yet as Archbishop Desmond Tutu said during a 2005 visit to Battle Creek, we live in a moral universe. In other words, social injustice and oppression, because they're so destructive to civilization, will eventually falter and fail. And whether tyrants like it or not, Archbishop Tutu says, that's how the world was created to operate. So sure enough, in 1994, there came that hallelujah moment. Apartheid finally fell. Guess what? Those scholarship students, the ones who had struggled against terrible odds as the first in their family and village to attend college, at last, history was on their side. As a black majority government took power and as racial barriers in employment fell, there was a huge need for trained black professionals. And I'm proud to say that literally hundreds of Kellogg bursary students stepped up and met the challenge as doctors, teachers, lawyers, and engineers. Many have truly become the movers and shakers in South Africa's government, ministries, universities, and corporations. That's what long-term perseverance can do for philanthropy. A second key way for philanthropy to make a global difference is by trying untested solutions while learning from past mistakes. Albert Einstein once told a group of Princeton students, the secret of creativity is knowing how to hide your sources. Well, in the foundation world, we don't need that kind of creativity. When we make a grant, we're looking to find solutions to social problems, whether it's AIDS, malaria, illiteracy, teen pregnancy, or what have you. We don't want to hide the sources of our success. We want to share them as widely as possible so that others can use them too. Except here's the rub. Foundations must also share their mistakes, awkward at times as that might be. Because as we all know, it's really the screw-ups in life that are usually the most instructive. Frank Lloyd Wright once famously said, doctors have to bury their mistakes, but an architect can only advise his clients to plant vines. Well, foundations fall, I think, somewhere in the middle. We don't bury our mistakes 6 feet under, but we do often relegate them to bland reports that go unread and unheeded. However, with their renewed emphasis on learning, I believe the foundations are starting to do a much better job of putting their hard-won experience to use under real-world experiences and conditions. A case in point is what's being called the New Green Revolution in Africa. As a recap, the first Green Revolution was one of the greatest scientific successes of the 20th century, or any century. It began in the mid-1940s with a partnership between the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundations and the U.S. government. Basically, its purpose was to develop new crop varieties, along with improved pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and irrigation systems that could greatly boost food production worldwide. The Green Revolution's first phase was launched in Mexico, and really with stunning results. In 1951, Mexico had not only averted a famine, but produced harvests bountiful enough to make wheat a national export crop. Yet the most dramatic success was yet to come. In 1961, India, with a population much larger than Mexico, was on the brink of mass famine. They sought help from Norman Borlaug, a Green Revolution crop scientist who later won the Nobel Prize. Soon after, India adopted a new variety of rice called IR8 that increased the annual rice harvest by an amazing tenfold. The threat of widespread famine in India, once seen as inevitable, had become vanquished. Nations across Asia soon adopted IR8 and other, quote, miracle seeds for corn and wheat during the 1960s and 70s, and with equally miraculous results. During the Green Revolution, the world's grain production increased by 250%, an accomplishment that saved hundreds of millions of lives. This is truly a remarkable achievement for humanity and philanthropy. It's also one that I'm sure a few program officers would love to put on their resume, probably right next to that Aquinas College degree. But having said that, the Green Revolution was by no means flawless. In fact, we still suffer today from many of its unintended consequences. All those new agrochemicals that were invented to kill weeds and insects, they often cause serious environmental damage, and over time, many of these pesky bugs became immune to the new pesticides anyway. Another problem with the Green Revolution was the cost of equipment and materials. Wealthy farmers could afford to buy new tractor seeds and irrigation equipment, but many poor farmers could not, and they'd go bankrupt and lose their land while trying to do so. In a similar way, the use of imported seeds tended to favor the big farmers and big ag corporations that made them. Meanwhile, many local varieties of seed, developed by small farmer co-ops to suit local conditions, were totally wiped out. My point here is not to debate who's right and who's wrong. Rather, it's how philanthropy can build on past successes and failures to move forward. So now let's fast forward to Africa in 2008, a place where the Green Revolution did not succeed. In fact, per capita food production in sub-Saharan Africa has actually gone down since the 1960s, the only region in the world where that's been the case. Into the fray have stepped the Rockefeller and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In 2007, they committed $150 million to fund the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, or AGRA. Simply put, AGRA's mission is to help Africa's small farmers, most of who are women, to grow enough food to feed the continent. AGRA's stated goal is to be, quote, pro-poor and pro-environment. They understand that for Africa to succeed, small farmers must succeed. And they'll have to do it by building on existing knowledge and networks. From farm fields to local universities, from new seeds to water conservation methods, AGRA will develop African solutions to African problems in ways that promote justice, peace, and dignity. Their challenge, and I would submit it's a big one, is to succeed in ways the first green revolution did not. These are lofty ideals, but they're built on practical realities. And it's this kind of hands-on innovation that philanthropy needs to change the world. More than ever, our work will have to involve well-conceived partnerships that are rooted in trust and even humility. Now, before I move on to the rhetorical fireworks display that will be point 4 of my speech, let me say a few words about partnerships, because they're truly crucial to the success of global philanthropy in the 21st century. Like many terms in the foundation world, the word partnership is often overused and misunderstood. It's kind of got that kumbaya ring to it. You know, it's nice to see this big philanthropic picnic with maybe a rain cloud or a turf battle in sight. But in truth, partnerships serve a much more realistic function. They're necessary because no person, organization, or cause can succeed on its own. The world's simply too interconnected and interdependent for that. To make change happen, we've got to find ways to make connections. For instance, the Kellogg Foundation has been making grants in Latin America and the Caribbean since the early 1940s. Last year, we awarded roughly $21 million in grants to the region, fairly typical for us. But what we've learned, though, is that it's not just how much you spend, but how you spend it that really makes a difference. Until the mid-1990s, we funded projects, a group of projects in areas of education, agriculture, and healthcare. In effect, we supported 1,000 points of light, often in places that otherwise lacked hope or possibility. Our grant dollars in Latin America provided the battery power, so to speak, that kept many of these efforts going and going and going. We funded some very good projects, but they needed ongoing outside support to be sustainable. So instead of forever buying new batteries, we decided to help build a power grid, if you would, that could energize and connect the good work of nonprofit organizations. What Latin America needed was a nonprofit sector, a partnership of donors, businesses, and government that could promote and enable charitable giving on a broad scale. Overall, the nonprofit sector in Brazil grew 2.5 times its previous size from 1996 to 2002. There are now 275,000 nonprofits in Brazil that provide 1.5 million jobs. So when we talk about partnerships between foundations, business, and governments, it's these kinds of possibilities that we should keep in mind. You know, in this country, it's easy to take the nonprofit sector for granted. We're used to tax deductions that provide a financial incentive for us to give. We're used to federal and state laws that make it fairly easy to start and run a nonprofit organization. That's why in the United States we have more than 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in this country. These laws and customs have encouraged Americans to be the most generous nation on earth in terms of charitable giving. We also accept the fact that nonprofits should be run by professionals who have training in fields such as management and finance. The Kellogg Foundation has helped build institutions such as the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University that promote learning and research in the nonprofit sector. There's even room in our country for noted scholars like Dr. Joel Orose, who we'll be hearing from later, to write nationally acclaimed books about philanthropy. In fact, I think many of you saw Joel as you were coming in, as he was selling some of those books out of the trunk of his car. At any rate, in a nutshell, what the Kellogg Foundation helped build in Latin America are new structures that have made philanthropy more organized, dynamic, and effective. Today, there are dozens of new foundations, dozens of businesses and corporations, large and small, that support philanthropy. There are universities and academic journals that advance the training and knowledge base of the nonprofit sector. From soccer stars to CEOs, philanthropy, once viewed largely as a job for the church or government, has become a viable and valuable public concern. So now my final point, let me mention a powerful force for giving that has happened quite independent of foundations and organized philanthropy. In fact, we had absolutely nothing to do with it. And I refer here to remittances. Basically, payments sent from individuals in a place like the United States to support their families and communities in in another country. We know that our country, and this community specifically, has been blessed with people who generously share their wealth. In Battle Creek, of course, we have the incredible legacy of W.K. Kellogg. But in Grand Rapids, we have the names of the DeVosses, the Van Andels, the Weggies, the Fries, the Secchias, just to name a few. Our communities, our nation, and our world are richer for their benevolence. But what the stunning statistics about remittances remind us is that there are other philanthropists in our midst. They may have names like Gonzalez, or Chen, or Patel. They may be the ones who harvest our fruit, the roof on our house, or clean this auditorium later this evening. In 2005, in the United States alone, these unheralded philanthropists donated a staggering $61 billion to aid in their home countries. During that same year, by comparison, U.S. foundations provided $2.2 billion in grants to developing countries according to the Index of Global Philanthropy. And since the remittances pass directly from family to family, they may not fit our traditional notions of philanthropy, yet the positive impact of remittances, which are typically spent for food, clothing, and shelter, is clear. In Mexico, studies show that households that receive remittances enjoy better nutrition and health, have lower mortality rates, and lower illiteracy rates than families that don't get remittances. In Eastern Europe, 1/4 of businesses paid for 40% of their startup costs with remittances. In the Dominican Republic, remittances now account for 37% of the gross national income. And although much of this giving is one-to-one, the people who send home remittances have begun to get more organized. Through dozens of U.S.-based hometown associations, they have are collectively starting to raise money to build houses, buy computers, or plant trees in places such as El Salvador and the Philippines. Well, foundations are looking at ways to build on this momentum. In Durham, North Carolina, a Kellogg Foundation grant has helped support the Latino Community Credit Union, the fastest growing credit union in the United States. It serves mainly Hispanic immigrants who didn't have access to banks before and often fall prey to theft and predatory lenders. At their credit union, members can wire home remittances at a much lower rate than elsewhere. Equally important, the credit union offers home and business loans, along with English, personal finances, and parenting classes. So while customers fund philanthropy abroad, they're gaining the knowledge and economic stability to help them succeed in the United States. And then there's the other end of the remittance transaction. When folks back home get the money, which is usually a wire transfer, how do they safeguard that windfall? Must they hide it in a mayonnaise jar or stuff it under their mattress at home? That may be half true, since many low-income people in developing countries have no access to commercial banks. And again, here's where philanthropy could help bridge the divide. I'm sure you've probably heard of microfinance institutions. They're basically little banks, much like credit unions, that make small loans to low-income people that banks consider far too risky. They started with the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and have since spread worldwide. What they can do with even a $500 loan to start a small grocery business or showing shop is often quite phenomenal. And by the way, repayment rates for these supposedly risky borrowers are generally far higher than most commercial banks. Well, the Kellogg Foundation has funded successful microfinance projects in Africa and Latin America. But what if we could help channel remittance payments back to hometown savings accounts in a microfinance institution? For one thing, the folks at home could earn some interest, at least more than they're probably getting in that mayonnaise jar. And they might also get a cheaper wire transfer rate. Importantly, with extra assets from these new accounts, the institutions would have more money to lend for socially useful purposes, which is what they're all about, and what I might add is what foundations are all about. So in closing, I'd like to say that mainstream philanthropy did not start the remittance movement. But perhaps maybe we can help it grow and diversify. And that's really true of everything that we do. We're here to serve, not to supervise. Philanthropy will never have enough money, good ideas, and clout to change the world on its own accord. It's not meant to. What we can do, and I think what we do well, is help form an expression to the healing hands of human generosity. And if enough of us can move that bus, then there is no question that we can move the world. Thank you.
And now we have two responders. Ramya, what do you think?
I'll have to tell myself how to start this, but let me begin by telling you somewhat of a story. My forays into development actually began somewhat pretty naively, with a very deep dislike for international development funding institutions, dislike for the state, I think for just about anything that was organized. I was a student at the time, and I got swept by what was called the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which quite literally in Hindi translates as Save the Narmada River Movement. This was an anti-dam movement in the early 1990s, funded by the World Bank at the time. And I think I just loved the euphoria of being in the streets and being with a bunch of students quite like me who just did not like anything institutionalized, anything large, anything powerful. Over time, when I actually began working in the development sector, I in fact started my work in the development sector in a starting microfinance institution back in southern India, I interacted with several farmers. And it was then that sort of it all fell together. I realized what was indeed wrong with development funding institutions, and what was indeed wrong was, I think, the farmers that I interacted with. This is the rice bowl of India in southern India. And the farmers I interacted with told me the story of how the Green Revolution was anything but green for them. Locally, it's actually popularly referred to as the Black Revolution. In that, the Green Revolution was successful in the northern parts of India, where the farmers were wheat growers. And by the time that Green Revolution had arrived in India in the early 1950s, a very miracle variety of wheat had already been experimented with in Mexico. So essentially, a prepared grain of wheat came to India. And the farmers up in India were very wealthy wheat farmers. The area was well irrigated. There was an agricultural research institution up in the northern state. There was good cooperation between the state and the local government. So the point I'm trying to get at is that for wheat, the Green Revolution was a success, primarily because the institutional stakeholders were ready. The grain was ready, the state was ready, the local government was ready, the farmers were ready. As far as rice was concerned, nobody was ready for rice. The strain of rice was still being developed. It was prone to attack by pesticides. The variety of rice that was grown as part of the Green Revolution was an enormous water guzzler. So farmers that actually were growing rice in the villages down in South India were using groundwater. And all of a sudden, this variety of water was sucking up water from the soil, and there was actual drought. There was absolutely no water down south. So I think what makes international development funding or development assistance or foreign aid, whatever name you give it, work perhaps is a considerable amount of time spent in understanding how do localities themselves define success. Let the locals define success and arguably, and even dictate success, I think. Yes, technological expertise is fantastic, but I think what was forgotten to an extent was actually spending time in localities understanding how they perceive success, what were their local practices, their local farming practices. This is not to say that foundations haven't understood or international development funding institutions haven't understood this, but I think sometimes those lessons are forgotten, which is again something that I wanted to emphasize. Another point quickly is foundations acknowledge blunders, but I think they don't publicize it. And I think blunders need to be publicized. everybody needs to know about them and indeed learn from them. Most of these lessons stay within the foundation world. And I think every institutional stakeholder needs to understand what went wrong. Because I think what makes philanthropy work is understanding that when it does work, what made it work, what clicked. So to indeed recognize the factors that actually made success possible, and success possible not for the donor, but also perhaps for the communities that it was planning to serve. And yes, philanthropy has considerable power to make global difference, but I think, a considerable amount, I think the linchpin really is power sharing. So it has the power to make a difference, but the power needs to be shared power. And I think that is about it. And perhaps the other last point that I wanted to point out was, and I think it goes back to learning. And I think learning has not to take place on a project-by-project basis, but more so retrospective, like really back in time, like 40 years down the road, what happened. So very long-term retrospective analysis that you really sit down and really think it through for a very long term as to what happened way back then. Why are we what we are now? And I think the roots of why something works or doesn't work in international development, the roots of it lie way back in time. And only because I've been at the receiving end of much of this power play, I think I see the other end of the spectrum. I haven't been a part of the foundation, but have been a development worker. So this is just my take on this.
Well, Ramya, thank you very much. And we'll have a chance.
Thanks.
We're very fortunate that she is at Grand Valley and in the community and very willing to volunteer. As Joel was introduced, he is a distinguished professor. We can't let that go at Grand Valley. And Joel, we're pleased you're here. What's your response?
Well, thank you, Dottie. You'll notice that Ramya and I, being professors at Grand Valley, did not rise to the podium. It's because we find it hard to stand up with the weight of what we know. Jim, on the other hand, popped up like a cork. But enough of those invidious comparisons. I'd like to focus on something that Jim talked about and that Ramya also brought up in her response, and that is the crucial importance of partnerships and power sharing. And pardon me, I was trained as a historian, so I always do this to people. But if you go back to 1945, the beginning of the baby boom just after World War II, 63 years ago, there was essentially one industrial economy left intact in the world, and that was the United States. So that in our international philanthropy, inevitably, we just did it alone, because who were you going to call on to be a partner and to be helpful? The shattered economies of Japan and Germany? Certainly not. Well, how things have changed in the last few years. We've gotten used to saying the richest person in the world, Bill Gates. Not true anymore. The richest person in the world is from Mexico now. Since our new century started 8 years ago, more billionaires have been created in China than have been created in the United States. And my demographer friends, I don't have a lot of friends, so I hang out with demographers, but my demographer friends tell me that if you have a new daughter this year, or niece or granddaughter, she is born into the biggest economy in the world by far. However, by the time she's ready to start high school, just 14 years from now, she'll be living in the second biggest economy in the world. And by the time she graduates from Grand Valley State University, 22 years from now, she is likely to be living in the third largest economy in the world. China and then India, both likely to surpass the United States in that time frame. What all that means for philanthropic partnerships is pretty clear. We can't do it alone anymore. We can't do the Marshall Plan anymore or the Green Revolution anymore. It's got to be done with partners, givers from other nations, and it's got to be done, as Ramya says, with power sharing, with mutual respect, as a coalition. So that, I think, is one of the profound lessons that we need to carry away from tonight. Just one other thought, and it also is on that partnership theme. We are beginning to see, interestingly, a flow back the other direction. When we think of ourselves in the United States, we think of ourselves as a donor nation. But we are beginning to see, slowly but surely, a trickle that is becoming a stronger stream every day of money coming to the United States as charitable gifts from individuals and also from governments in other nations. Sometimes it's done certainly with the best of intentions and noblest of intentions. Other times when Hugo Chavez does it with Katrina, it's probably done with quite a little political, shall we say, kicker to it. But more and more it's happening. And more we're beginning to learn what it's like to be a recipient. And the same kinds of things that Ramya has been talking about, the kinds of resentments that can flow from that. What happens, for example, if Grand Valley State University is offered an endowed chair in an area that's controversial? For example, in jihad studies. These are the kinds of issues that institutions are going to have to face as we get into this more interdependent, more even playing field world. So stay tuned. The fun is only beginning in philanthropy.
Thank you. Well, now it is your turn, and we'd like to include and have some responses for as many questions as possible. So there's microphones at either side. If you would just make your way there, that would be terrific. And while you are all flocking to the microphones, and if you know who you want to direct it to, please say so. But Jim, let me start off with a question to you. Some people have said that U.S. philanthropies, there's enough need right here at home, and why in the world are they going international? What would be your answer to them?
Well, I don't see it as an either or. I see it as a both and. One, if you look at the Kellogg Foundation, we know that Mr. Kellogg had international interests. Mr. Kellogg was still very actively involved with the board of the Kellogg Foundation in 1941 when this foundation made a commitment to start moving into Latin America. But the world's much different today for my children than it was when I was their age. We're becoming much more globalized and much more connected. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really start learning from one another. I just think of opportunities that we, through our work in Southern Africa, have been able to connect some of our grantees in the United States. What was seen as maybe some clever, cute arts and crafts in Southern Africa, we had some similar things going on with Native American communities in New Mexico. And how we've been able to bring these individuals together. And together, they're now starting to look at how they can form some global markets. So you go into this small little village in Mozambique, and you see this individual making these beautiful sculptures out of wood. And on his table, in his hut, is a magazine from Architectural Digest. And there's a piece of his work sitting on this table in this penthouse in New York. And so bridging these organizations, these individuals together, working with organizations that we can introduce them to, such as Aid to Artisans, we're now able to form global markets and learning from one another. So I think there's plenty for us to learn together.
Thank you. Please.
Hi. Well, when it comes to philanthropy, you said yes, but. And I guess I want to talk more about the but. because, of course, yes. I mean, who would be against it? But I worked in foreign aid both for the U.S. government and for Oxfam America, a nonprofit organization. And I have to say there were some pretty big buts to both. But two of the things I want to focus on that I think are really important and I think were underemphasized, although just touched on a little bit in your talks. One was the question of coordination of philanthropy, because a lot of times I saw donors who were private doing things in all different directions and not really coordinating what they were doing. And they came at cross purposes. They confused recipients. They sent villages into a tizzy because they didn't want to work with the government. And we were as guilty as that as anyone else. But that's a big problem. The other one is about how democratic philanthropic aid is, because I think it's very hard for a nonprofit organization or for a philanthropic organization not to overemphasize what the donor wants. So that if you have a donor organization that really insists on a certain Christian agenda or jihad agenda or abstinence-only agenda or, I don't know, I mean, I just think that when it comes to deciding how funds are used, the people who give them money have more say. So, for example, through my tax dollars, I feel like I have fair representation how money gets spent in Grand Rapids. But through the Grand Rapids Foundation or some other community foundation where some people give a lot more money than I do, I don't have equal say. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the political nature or the non-democratic nature of philanthropy.
Jim?
Thanks, Daddy. I think one thing I take great pride in the Kellogg Foundation is we've been in existence for 78 years. And Mr. Kellogg has been gone since 1951. But we take very seriously the values and the philosophy of Mr. Kellogg. Every year our Board of Trustees takes its annual board retreat, and in their packets we review Mr. Kellogg's letter of 1935, the letter that he wrote to his trustees. And so we take Mr. Kellogg's intent very seriously and pay very close attention to that. And so we really try to keep in mind exactly what his philosophical beliefs were, what his values were as the stewards of Mr. Kellogg's resources. Another thing is really, and I think it was touched on earlier, is how critically important it is that U.S. foundations, we're not an international foundation. We are a U.S.-based foundation that does international work. I think there's a difference there. We don't have any trustees from around the world. All of our trustees are here in the United States. But we fully appreciate and understand the importance of the cultural context and all the work that we're doing in other countries. And one thing that we have learned is that while there are very bright U.S. citizens who know an awful lot about issues in Southern Africa and Latin America, we don't feel it's our role to parachute those experts into those areas to do our programming. We make it a point that our program staff from that region is from that region. So not only are they experts on the issues, but they also understand the international context of which they're operating.
Joel, do you have anything to add?
Well, it's one of those interesting questions that we could talk about all night, and actually I'd very much like to. But it's one of those strange systems, that the old joke is that it's all about the golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. And yet, I have seen this happen many times where foundations start off and the donor has a very rigid or very fixed idea about what needs to be done, to save the heathens in some other country. And they make these horrible mistakes, just horrible mistakes. And they go through all the stages of grief and denial and so forth. And then eventually they finally come to a realization that, maybe it's something I'm doing wrong. And you see donors go through that education process, some consciously, some not so consciously, but they end up in a pretty good place nonetheless. I wish the system were more efficient, and we are trying to make it more efficient, to put in a little plug for the Johnson Center, by the grant-making school that we operate, that puts a tremendous emphasis on working with recipients and respectfully listening to recipients, understanding the context and the culture, and bringing on the voices so that you're not doing things to people, but rather with people. I wish more folks would take advantage of that, because there's a lot of inefficiency on the front end as new foundations get started and make mistakes, and in fact sometimes make the same mistakes that the foundation down the road made last year. One of my favorite quotes is by Dorothy Parker, who said, "It isn't one damn thing after another, it's the same damn thing over and over."
It's not just in international situations where there's not this coordination. If I look at the Gulf Coast and what has happened as a result of Hurricane Katrina, the Kellogg Foundation has been one of the largest funders. I think we've invested over $36 million in recovery efforts there, and we're taking a long-term view, by the way. We don't intend to kind of pack up now and move. We continue our discussions to look at what role we can play. But if you look at literally dozens of funders around this country who have gone into New Orleans specifically, independent of all the other foundations, asking people to give them their tours of the Ninth Ward, and there's no coordination that's taking place whatsoever in that area. And just as recently last week, some of us said, one of the greatest things that we could probably do for that area is if we could fund a position or an office of someone whose job it is to really start doing a much better job of the coordination of funders with good intentions who are interested in going down there, who can answer the questions of what this funder is going to do, or what this funder is looking at, or even coordinating the tours. I mean, look at Jeffrey Thomas, Jeffrey Canada at the Harlem Children's Zone. Everybody wants to see what Jeffrey is doing. Well, he's charging for tours. And maybe they should do the same thing. If funders or others are coming to tour the Ninth Ward and others, maybe they need to start charging for those tours to start paying for that type of stuff.
At a practical level, and I do want to chip in, from the nonprofit side of the world, I mean, we do realize that whoever pays the piper calls the tune, which is another quip. Whoever pays the piper calls the tune. But just to speak from being on the nonprofit side, it takes a lot of patient negotiation, I think, persistent negotiation and building relationships with donors. And one strategy that I think also works, of course, contextually defined, is coordinating for nonprofits to actually have a solid mass base with links with grassroots movements. I think because with people comes voice, and I think you can influence donor agendas by shouting louder. And sometimes to be heard, you quite need to have large numbers. So I think coordination across organizations and movements. So as much as the foundation world needs to cooperate with one another, I think nonprofits and grassroots movements need to come together as well to sort of increase leverage, to sort of build power from base up.
Very well said. Before you leave, I want to address the politics of philanthropy that you referenced. And I will be the first one to say there's the Lucky Sperm Club. You are just born into this. Melinda Gates, I have been in meetings with Melinda Gates, who has said that they have funded huge initiatives simply by some literature that came across their desk or was on their coffee table. Now, they didn't measure one disease, African disease, with another African disease. They just read about the one and proceeded to throw in $50 million. And wouldn't we all love to be able to have the resources to be able to respond that way? So funding is not all politics. There's a lot of hard work that goes into decisions, and there's a lot of hard work into providing solutions. But there's clearly some luck thrown in there, too. Thank you. Sir.
Hi. Well, you have to forgive me. I have a little joke to say first, but I'm the proud son of a father who has at least the career ability to live outside of the States and spend his money kind of in other economies. And you had brought up the tsunami. My dad was in Thailand during the tsunami, and when me and my sister were finally able to get a hold of him after a couple of days, we asked him when he was coming home. And he said, "Oh, I can't do that." And we go, "Why?" And he goes, "Well, all the damn Europeans left, so somebody's got to stick around and drink all the beer in this country." So, I did have a two-part question. The Great Decision books illustrates the money, kind of the philanthropy money versus the kind of trade markets opening up. And in terms of agricultural production, largely probably those are the commodities that would be produced. How many hurdles do you guys foresee these countries running into, given that these are still somewhat the backbone of like a U.S. industry that is regularly in that market, and then others? And then second part, in the growing kind of business atmosphere of philanthropy, what is the outlook, or can you make any educated assumption on to corruption making its way into that large money atmosphere at all?
Should I assign one of you?
Yeah, that works best, doesn't it? Yeah.
Who wants to dive in on agriculture?
I think you work for a foundation that funds agriculture.
Exactly. It is a priority area, isn't it? I was, but I'm just trying to phrase this best.
We'll start with the corruption.
Corruption.
Look to Joel.
Little sin. Okay. Maybe a lot.
Well, there is a real danger of corruption following, the fact that philanthropy has been, by and large, corruption-free. There have been a few isolated incidents over the years, but the fact that it has been corruption-free has been the fact that there hasn't been that much money in it. As the amounts grow larger, the danger certainly grows that it will become a more lucrative place to practice ill-gotten gains. But I have to say, one of the things that most foundations do pretty well is watch that money and have internal controls over that money, because that tends to be the thing that is the most embarrassing thing. Making bad grants, that's embarrassing, but you took a risk and it failed. Having your money extorted or literally stolen away, that would be tough and embarrassing to explain. I know the internal audit department of the Kellogg Foundation, everyone fears the internal auditor. Everyone. Jim does not look nearly so cool, calm, and collected when the internal auditors are around.
Actually, I'd say the internal audit function of the Kellogg Foundation is really important, because we don't look at it as a way of trying to get you. We randomly do select grantees to review and visit our projects to make sure that the dollars are being spent. But the grantees really see it as a benefit, because in many instances, the internal auditors can really help the grantees put some stronger systems in place that they normally don't have, particularly since the Kellogg Foundation does fund a lot of grassroots organizations. But I think the corruption can also be internally at foundations. And I know as an officer at the Kellogg Foundation, internal audit reviews every one of my expense statements. The chair of the audit committee and the audit committee sees every expense that I have on foundation business. So we do take that function very seriously. And I think in the 15 years at the Kellogg Foundation, I think I only know of maybe 2 or 3 situations where we have felt there was any type of fraud with that grantee with the use of Kellogg funds.
That, by the way, is why Jim always makes you pay when he asks you to lunch. So.
The other aspect of this is the ethical dilemma. And because I've been around a long time in philanthropy, I've been on the ethics squad, I would call it, for the Council on Foundations, and have had the unpleasant task to go to a foundation I will not name and question the way they were operating and doing business and spending their money, particularly for their trustees, and the trips that they would take and the expenses that were made. And those things are never pleasant, especially when you know those individuals, but I felt that it was my role. I will say it was in Washington, D.C., and when I went there and said, why do you think I would come on a Friday in July with 90-degree plus temperatures, knowing I'm not going to get home until midnight? Why do you think I'd do that? Because we all have to step up to this. And I would hope this young man who asked the question, if you see problems, let's hear about them. They need to be corrected, and we all have to monitor ourselves. How about some other questions? Sir? Oh, excuse me.
Good evening. I am an international graduate student at Grand Valley State University. I am from Kazakhstan. I'm here for 2 years. And while I am going deeper and deeper into the nonprofit sector history in the U.S., I have prominent distinguished professors that I can come and ask any questions. So today I am interested in respond to my question from Dr. Johnson and Dr. McHale. My question is with the sustainability issue of the international aid. So Kazakhstan is one of the 5 Central Asian countries. We received, I don't remember the numbers, but within the last 15 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, help from the United States through the United States International Aid Agency, USAID, and several of the huge international and multinational organizations as ACDIVOC, Mercy Corps, CHS. Most of them were focusing on infrastructure, community development. But my question is, so you helped us in 15 years, and now even USAID office in Kazakhstan is closing. The response is that the Kazakhstan economy is growing, and you have your own local resources to support your own projects. But the problem is we don't know how to go further because we don't have experience with endowment, community foundations. We don't have understanding of board of trustees or trusteeship, not because we just don't know, but just there are not essence of this concept in that part of the world. So, and now as a representative of my country, I feel a huge gap because we don't know, we don't do and fund any more development projects because we are kind of developed, and we don't need extra international aid because economy is growing, and so what? And my question is, what to do? So how to develop our philanthropic issues? Because, I mean, predominantly, of course, the population is Muslim. Of course, we give, but it's most of the time anonymously, and no one will never count. It's one part, maybe, of the questions. The second is essence of volunteering. Within the 70 years under the Soviet regime, volunteering was compulsory.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, all the time, when I tell this, everyone smiles, but it's true. I was pioneer, I was Komsomol, but I was compulsory volunteering because nobody gave me a choice if I like to volunteer for mental health services or I would like to build a house. I was sent to build a house or gather a cotton because my government wanted it for me. So, and even as I have said, USAID will close its office. So does it mean that US foreign policy won't be in Central Asia anymore? Or it will be on the level only of development? Build roads, you have a light, that's great, let's go somewhere else. So, of course I understand I got a scholarship from US State Department and I will be back and I will gather all these resources that I am taking right now, actually from Grand Valley State University, from Johnson Center for Philanthropy, I'm volunteering there, from Grand Rapids Community Foundation. I won't sit there and pretend that I have never heard about all that things. So, of course, or maybe I should use suggestion of my professor, shout louder, and I can do it actually. So, yeah, please suggest.
I'm going to one-stop shopping. Take yourself over to Flint to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. They have funded in the very area that you're talking about. You yourself should be a consultant to them. They had me over there, and that's where I learned that volunteerism was communism. And I couldn't even use the word. I was helping them start community foundations over there. It's not a simple answer, but short term, because we have more questions, and I'm going to turn to my colleague, Jim.
No, something similar. Foundations are often described as a big pot of money with a bunch of people surrounding it. But foundations really have much more than financial resources. They really have knowledge. And so what I'd love to do is visit with you afterwards and let's identify who some of those other foundations are, who are some people that you can pick up the phone and talk to. I think while the Kellogg Foundation does a program there, I certainly have some colleagues at the foundation who can provide you some really good insights and contacts of other individuals.
Yeah, and I maybe should also say that maybe you have never heard, but I am long-term outcome of Kellogg Foundation. Because I used to work for Eurasia Foundation in Kazakhstan, and all our programs were based on Kellogg Foundation materials. So maybe even you don't know about that, but back in Kazakhstan, in 20 hours flight from Grand Rapids, you have some people over there that will be thankful to Mr. Kellogg.
Logic models.
Good job, Jim. Sir.
I don't know if this is off subject or not, but do fair trade organizations have any relevance to philanthropy? Do you have any knowledge of the fair trade movement? Does it ever interact with philanthropists?
When you talk about fair trade movements, you're talking about, for example, making sure that folks who grow coffee get a fair price for the crop that they grow.
Yes, I realize that's not philanthropy. It's kind of another form of free enterprise, but I just wondered if there's any, if the philanthropy and fair trade ever meet and there's ever...
I think a lot of farmers' cooperatives and sort of community-based organizations, so I think there's a great amount of intersection actually with the fair trade movement, yeah.
I think there's plenty of examples of the Kellogg Foundation's work specifically in Southern Africa that you could point to in areas of Mozambique and South Africa and Lesotho specifically, where you could see some examples of that. I'd encourage you actually to visit our website and you could see some grantees there and learn more a little bit about that.
Thank you.
Sir.
Hi there. I work for a local small nonprofit organization, and I'm also in the graduate program over there at GVSU. It's a pleasure to see a lot of my teachers here and our members and our donors. And my question relates to how small foundations, small nonprofits, be they national or international, are able to compete to get the attention of funders now. I mean, talk about how many more nonprofits there are in this country, and then on top of that, the growth internationally of nonprofit organizations. It seems like it's very difficult to have your voice even heard by a lot of funders. So that's my question.
Well, I'll start.
Shout louder.
I think a lot of it has to do with relationships. We encourage you to send in your application online and such, and that's all fine and well. But let's be honest. You send it directly to Jim McHale or directly to a program director. It has a tendency to probably get a little higher on the desk in your office. If you've got some other funders that you're working with who are willing to pick up the phone and call someone that they might have a relationship with at the Kellogg Foundation, obviously there's that interest. But I think of the Kellogg Foundation, our Board of Trustees has recently told us, as we've adopted a new framework and moving forward, that they feel very strongly that we shouldn't be working just with all the usual suspects that we've always worked with. We really need to start looking at working with other funders, with other grantees, a big part of our program directors. And I think the program directors have the best job at the Kellogg Foundation. I mean, they are the ones out there in communities, identifying organizations just like yours for us to start investing in and hopefully building the capacity up. So I would, don't pay attention to everything online. I'd actually get on the phone and start asking for some individuals, asking for me specifically. Let's chat, and then I can put you in touch with people. But I think to do that, you will. Get your application in triplicate. That's fine as well. But that'll be a big part of it, relationships.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Please.
My follow-up question relates to the fact that sometimes the impression you get when you're someone who's coming and asking for money is that there's an interest in, the new girl on the block, that nonprofit that you haven't heard of before in that area that you haven't been involved with. And what I'm hearing you saying is something that I think is very true, that people say, well, at some point you have to be able to stand up for yourself. You have to find your own source of funding. But how does that play itself out when you're an organization that has a relationship, you're no longer the new darling, but there's, ongoing need? I guess it's the second part of the same question, which is, not only number one, how do you make your voice heard, but how do you continue to make it clear that there's an ongoing programmatic need for whatever it is you're providing. When you get to a point where I think quite often people say, well, try again next year.
Well, again, I think it comes down to really frank, honest conversation with your program officer at the foundation. Look, if I'm your program officer, I want to make darn sure that when our funding ends 3 years from now or 5 years from now, that your programs are able to continue. So what opportunities, most grants have a line item around evaluation because we feel, yes, you've got to do an evaluation. But what you don't see as much of, and I'm trying to encourage us to do more of, is also adding a line item of sending this individual to the fundraising school. The Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University has a wonderful fundraising school. I think that's also part of our responsibility of working with you to help develop those types of capacities and giving you plenty of time to start putting that donor base in place and identifying other funders. Joel, you can find those plenty.
Well, one of the interesting dichotomies of this is that people often say, "Oh, it's just who you know that gets you money," and I say yes, and thank heavens, because if that wasn't the case, it would be the richest organizations. Suppose it was all based on the best stuff that you could kick out with a computer. Well, the richest organizations with the biggest computers would get everything. There is still room in philanthropy for getting to know people, because ultimately, foundations don't make grants to organizations. They make bets on individuals. They look at people and they say, Ramya can do this. I really believe that she can. So that's why, on the other hand, I get really horrified when people say, "Oh yeah, we have a director of development. She's 10% of her time on that, and 20% of her time on tax compliance." And raising money is a full-time job, and it's a relational job, and it's one relation after another. So that has to be what the fundraiser does, and a lot of what the executive director does.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, exactly what I meant. So patiently negotiating. And he's been my student, so he's heard me say this many times. But
I had to patiently negotiate with you, as a matter of
I'm sure.
Truth be told.
But the fruits were good. The outcome was excellent.
We have time for one more question.
You said that there's a plethora of NPOs all over the United States because they have a lot of incentives. Is there anyone working on developmental countries, like on developing countries, working on developments to provide incentives for their NPOs? And if so, who are they?
Are you talking about matching grants?
No, I'm talking about, like, say the tax breaks we're giving our nonprofit organizations. Other countries aren't offering those incentives, and that's why they're faltering in foundations and NPOs. What can we do here in order to develop those sorts of things in other countries?
I will jump in here and tell you that I've been associated with the Kellogg Foundation for many years. 20 years ago, I said, why don't we just fund lobbyists and tax attorneys to get these things put in place in these various and sundry countries? We did investigate it, and it's much more complicated culturally. We talked about earlier communism and volunteerism. Well, there are no incentives there to be giving. There are a few that are creeping up in different parts of the world, which we could talk about. Jim? Joel?
Well, as I mentioned, just the work that the Kellogg Foundation has done in Brazil. We had kept feeding all these batteries, but we knew we really need to help put a strong nonprofit sector in place, and as a result of not just our work, but partnering with other foundations, we've been able to help create that environment. And so now how do we take what it is that we've learned in Brazil and start doing that in some other countries as well? Joel mentioned Carlos Slim earlier, the wealthiest man in the world. Carlos Slim is really matching a lot of U.S. funders. Bring your funding into Mexico and he'll match it dollar for dollar. And so what other opportunities might there be for that as well?
I thought you were going to ask this question, and since you didn't, I'm going to ask Jim. If I'm a young person and I want to get a job or an internship at the Kellogg Foundation to work in international philanthropy, what do I do?
Yeah. I think first, obviously, you
pay for Jim's lunch.
I think First, obviously, you get your degree at Aquinas College, like I did. I think first you have to find out, really, what are your passions? Start pursuing those. If you look at our program staff specifically, many of them, their ticket of entry is having some experience or expertise in the broad areas that we fund of education or philanthropy and volunteerism or health or in food systems and rural development, people who have real-life practical experiences there. I would encourage you to get an understanding of how this nonprofit sector works. So I'd encourage you to start volunteering at organizations, maybe serving on boards. I think it's critically important for anybody who sits in my seat or the seat of a program director, truly understands how humbling it is to ask other people for money. And so I think there's great merit in somebody fully understanding what it takes to raise money. And then, as I joke a lot with Joel, but I think the grant-making school at Grand Valley State University is critically important to this sector. And very few foundations, and it's a new program, I might add, but very few foundations, the Kellogg Foundation included, has really taken advantage of that. Now, grant-making is not, it's not an easy thing to do. You don't want a surgeon operating on you who's never operated, or you don't want a lawyer defending you who's never defended somebody or even has a degree in law. So we really have to start taking this whole field of philanthropy and grant-making, I think, much more seriously. And so also look at opportunities of classes you could take at the Johnson Center.
Just very quickly to add to that, I would do all that Jim said, plus there are 3 ways to get into most foundations. Number 1 is the way I got hired by the Kellogg Foundation. I became a grantee. And when you have a grantee, you work with that grantee quite a bit. You get a chance to observe her or him and how they operate. And then you can say, well, we've got an opening. Would you like to apply? That's one. Second, if foundations operate a fellowship program, try to become a fellow of that foundation. Same thing. You get to watch them over the years, and you see the ones who are really quite qualified. Kellogg Foundation, I think, hired probably a dozen of its own fellows over a 20-year period. And third, if all else fails, become a consultant to the foundation, because once again, you work with the program officer. It's sort of like an extended job interview in many ways. They see you at your best and at your worst, and if your best is good enough, you end up getting hired.
Well, with those words of wisdom, let me just ask, any last parting words that any of you would like to share? If not, we will be around for a few moments, and I thank you all. Jim, thanks for your inspiration and your response.